I had identified in all of that when so in the early days, there was a site called City Search. It actually still exists. It's not what it originally was created to be. They had hoped it would be kind of the hub for every city. You know, AOL, everybody was trying to create their hub for every city. Even all the search engines tried to personalize it. But one of the things that we learned when we were fighting it out, trying to compete with the AT&Ts and the Sprints, is we thought all these radio stations need websites, and they're not on the air yet. And they have the most to benefit from the internet because television has a face, radio didn't. Newspaper has things that you can print, and the web was going to give radio the ability to have coupons that could be printed and redeemed. And so we, you know, and radio never had a relationship with their listeners. And so we thought, you know, at that time I had befriended Seth Godin, and his book Permission Marketing really had a big impact on me. And so we were working on how we could help radio stations for the first time.
Right there on my shelf. No, Permission Marketing is right there on my shelf.
Yeah. I mean, that was a game changer for me. And, you know, radio, like I said, they didn't know who their listeners were. They never knew who was going to tune in the next day or how many of them were, but they were being paid based on the perception of who was listening. And so anyway, with all that said, we partnered with radio stations with our franchisees. So around the country, we would go to radio stations and say, we'll build your website. We just want you to promote our ISP, drive traffic to it. So the talent would drive traffic and sign up for our, you know, businesses. And it worked so well that at that time, consolidation started hitting the radio industry, and groups like Clear Channel and ABC and CBS and Intercom and all these major radio groups. Before, you could only have 6 AMs and 6 FMs, and all of a sudden you got Clear Channel with 1,200 radio stations. And so what happened is these guys would say, hey, you guys got this really awesome website, where'd it come from? And so there was this huge demand for us to do something that wasn't even our core business. We're trying to sell franchises and help our franchisees sell more internet customers. And instead, we got radio stations saying, hey, we need this technology. And so that became my next business. And we basically became the de facto standard for the radio industry. We hosted 70% of the 10,000 radio station websites in the country. And that kind of turned in. And then we went to Canada and Australia and Europe, and it just really blew up.
How long did it take from launch to critical mass? Like when you felt like you were hitting that tipping point where it was easier to onboard and attract the customers and get them closed than it was to have to pitch them all the time and get in front of them?
Yeah. So it took 18 months for two critical things to take place. So when we first started, we're just cold calling and we're trying to leverage the existing relationships we had. But very quickly, I said, who's got a relationship with all the radio stations in the country? And there were two national reps at that time, Katz and Interrep. And I picked Interrep because he just was somebody that I resonated more. And he was based in New York, and he was a public company. Katz was private. And I cold called the guy and pitched him on what we were doing with radio, and that I wanted to leverage his relationships and that he could benefit from the revenue that we were going to generate. And when we were sitting in there on our pitch, he had already had 100 pitches coming at him, and they were all promising, basically they wanted to, you know, their services would be for free and they would make all this money up on the advertising. And I was the first one that went in there and pitched it like a franchise play and how we were going to make our money. And he just looked across the table from me and said, you know, the first thing he says, first of all, you started this pitch out saying, I'm just this small town boy from Nebraska. He said, right away, I realized that you were more than that. And he said, secondly, you're the first person to come in here. Cause I looked at him and I said, look, Ralph, his name was Ralph Guild. I said, we've spent millions of dollars to get to this place, and I'm not going to sit here and tell you that I've got it all figured out, but I can tell you that there's 2,000 rabbit holes that we've already gone down that we want to let you or your customers go down. And there's about 6 things we figured out really work, and we're going to focus on those things. And he said that was the most sobering thing he had ever heard coming out of the internet guy, because everyone was promising the world at that time. Well, he then walked me in the door. Yeah. He walked me in the door to the CEO of ABC Radio, and we signed up all 40 of their stations at that time. And with that, I got a personal invitation to meet Mel Karmazin with Infinity, which is CBS television and radio. And I remember walking in the door, and it was the same thing. I walk in, and he goes, "Look, I want to make this clear, young man. You're only here because Ralph Guild asked for this appointment. You've got 2 minutes to get my attention, or you're out the door." And I just looked at him and said, "Well, I don't know if I can get it out in 10 minutes, but he says, well, what do you do that's so much better than everybody else?" And I go, "Well, the only thing I can really tell you is there's a couple thousand things that we've done spending millions of dollars that I won't let you or your customers do again. And there's a half a dozen here." And anyway, I said the same thing to him, and he looks at me and says, "You got my attention. You got 20 minutes. And ultimately, I ended up getting, CBS. Well, at that point, when you talk about critical mass, when you're talking about branded radio, so Clear Channel actually became the biggest group out there, but they didn't have the brand back then. They do now because they bought Outdoor and they bought the venues, and they branded themselves everywhere. But come on, we grew up knowing 3 brands, right? It was ABC, CBS, and NBC, and that was from television. A lot of the world didn't necessarily know that they owned radio stations, because back then they didn't necessarily say the name of the ownership. You just heard the call letters and the slogan. But those branded names were very well known by all the other groups. And so before long, we're not pitching anybody. Everyone's saying, it's kind of like you'll never get fired for, picking at IBM.
IBM,
well,
right?
Point,
well, and that's what I was curious, because every home run business gets to the point where the customers, prospects are chasing them down instead of you chasing the other way. And so to me, it really is a tipping point that, where does it change where you're no longer having to cold call your way in and make 100 pitches to get the one meeting, and turn that table. So it was about 18 months for you then. That's great.
Yeah.
Because that's the thing, like a lot of people, and not projecting onto anybody listening to this right now, but I think that's where a lot of entrepreneurs have the misnomer that if we build it, they will come, and this has got the world by the tail, and all we need is 1 or 2 great customers, and the rest will follow them and get that social proof. And I think like you showed, like you had to get some heavy hitters and have some traction of success to get their attention, and then you leveraged them well.
Right.
So what
and I gave
happened
up
with that?
20% equity.
Did you?
Yeah. That business ended very successfully. I actually sold it for equity to a company out of Minneapolis called Quick Pages, which became Annuity, and they had 100,000 small businesses around the country that were buying web pages from, or websites from them, and they had figured out the formula. But they basically made all their money with WorldCom, before the big problems with WorldCom, and because of those LEC relationships, they had call centers where they were winning over the long distance business. So they knew that whole business, and so they were now calling small businesses. And with that LEC relationship, they, on a single call, could sell them a 12-month website package without them having to put their credit card out, because the phone company would act as the currency. It would show up on the phone bill, and then, they pay them a 10% billing in it. And so they had sold 100,000 of them, but they started running into this problem of, now we have 100,000 customers and they have websites, but nobody knows the website exists. They're not, how do we let their customers know they're there? And so they acquired us because of all of our radio stations. We would put directories together in every city with all these pages and teach them how to put offers up there, right? And so that was the first company that I was in the process of the S1. That one did not end up going out, though, because we had Piper Jaffray, Prudential, and Robertson Stevens. I remember the day they all drove in their limos. It was amazing, all just coming out in their suits and their expensive shoes and fresh haircuts, and sitting there lined up on these long board tables, and the analyst sitting there asking all the questions. And again, my head spinning, because this is only a few years after I moved to California, and all of a sudden we're going to go public, and it's being projected to be $1 billion IPO. We did a $60 million mezzanine round. I remember they looked at me across the table and said, "Son, you've got about 60 people and you need to hire 100 people in the next 6 months." And I'm looking on going, what? What am I going to do with 100 people? We just raised $60 million. And if we don't demonstrate we can spend it, we're never going to raise any more. And I remember.
if we don't demonstrate we can spend it.
We lost your audio.
You, Chad. Your audio's dead. Did your cell phone die?
Chad.
Your audio's gone. We can't hear you.
We can't hear you. Uh-oh. We
So
we lost as your phone. Did your phone hang up, Chad?
yeah, it says his phone hung up. Let's see. I'll send him.
Hello?
Oh, there we go. You're back.
You hear me?
Yep.
Okay, so if you
Yeah,
don't
I
hire
guess the call
100,
dropped.
if you don't hire 100 people, we'll never get the next round. Just keep going.
Yeah, so basically they looked at me and said, this isn't a request, this is an order, and we're never going to raise more money if we can't demonstrate that we can spend the first amount of money. And I told them, I go, well, I can't guarantee an ROI on these 100. And they said, we don't need to show an ROI. The faster we show an ROI, the quicker we're worth less. It needs to be a mystery. People can't figure it out. They need to be able to extrapolate it on their own. The more you lose, the more you're worth. And I'm like, what the heck? But that's the world we lived in. And, wasn't like literally 1 week before we're supposed to be ringing the bell, the whole market just went to hell. Now we spend the next 2 years right
This
sizing.
is when? This is when?
2001.
Pardon me?
This is
2001.
2001 .com crash?
Correct. No,
Oh.
the .com crash was before 2001. Wasn't it 2000?
It was,
2000.
I forget
Yeah.
one or the other.
It's like 99, 2000. Because in 2001, I was already moving on to buying myself back. So I had sold my company for equity in what was going to be $1 billion IPO. And, 2 years later, I'm raising money to buy it back. That was interesting. Selling it for paper that, I could use to light a fire with. But we learned a lot during that time. That is a lot of the things that we spent millions of dollars on to learn half a dozen things that really worked during that time.